Jeff Nichols, you directed the film Loving, which tells the story of Richard and Mildred Loving, who successfully fought against the laws in the United States, or specifically Virginia, barring interracial marriage. How did you first become interested in this story, and what made you want to tell it?
I was first approached in 2012 by three of the producers: Colin Firth, the actor, his producing partner, Jed Doherty. They have a company called Rain Dog Films, and Nancy Bursky. And Nancy Bursky had made a documentary called The Loving Story. And that was my first awareness of Richard and Mildred Loving, was through her documentary, which was beautiful. The reason I chose to do it is because I just immediately fell in love with these people. And I fell in love with the love they had for one another. I really do think, and I say this without hyperbole, that this is one of the greatest love stories in American history. I was just tremendously touched and affected by it. And I immediately saw parallels to the types of people that I knew. Even though my grandparents were not an interracial couple, their behavior seemed very similar to Richard and Mildred's, in terms of my grandfather being a very quiet person and a very stoic person, and my grandmother being in the two, kind of the more outspoken and but also at the same time very reserved. I just felt like I knew and understood these people.
Of course, making a film based on true events, does that affect your approach as a filmmaker to tackle the story of people's true lives, as opposed to previous films that you've made where it's just been your own story that you created?
Certainly. I mean, there's a lot of pressure around it. There's a lot of responsibility that you feel to get it right, which doesn't mean to make Richard and Mildred better than they were. It just means to try and understand who they were. I think they were pretty great people, though. And at the end of the day, you're going to be watching my interpretation of who I think they were, and there's a lot of pressure that comes along with that, especially with a story like this that takes place in such a tumultuous time in our nation's history, given the civil rights movement and the Jim Crow South. I was born in 1978, so I think there was a lot of trepidation and fear on my side of things, that I wouldn't be able to tell that story correctly or give that perspective correctly, which is still probably true. But when I thought about Richard and Mildred and their relationship specifically, I felt very comfortable. And the four other films that I've done have all been cut from whole creative cloth. I just created them from my mind, and so the process of getting ready to write is much different. What is a dreamy process where I just kind of put music on and think about aliens or killer storms or boats and trees, that then becomes a process of research where I'm trying to learn as much as I possibly can about the real situation and the real people in this place that they were from. So the interesting thing is, though, once you've done that research, then the mechanics and the process are pretty similar.
Now, Richard and Mildred, of course, are no longer with us, but they do have a surviving daughter, Peggy. What was it like having her, being there to give input into the film and to react to the film after the fact?
Well, again, it was also added a lot of pressure to the experience. She's the first person I met with when I went to Virginia back in 2012 when I started research for this. I immediately showed up. I had all these questions. I wanted to know if there was music in the home, or laughter, or kind of TV shows that they watched, just real kind of mundane things. I just wanted to know about these details. And I quickly realized, Peggy is a very private person, much like her parents. And she was very kind to me. But it wasn't like a floodgate of details kind of rushed out. So it became more of a process of presenting things to her. I presented the script to her before we shot, and I showed her Joel and Ruth, and then she came to set a few times, and it was really more of it felt like a blessing or permission, where she kind of gave us a thumbs up and said, "You're doing okay." And I was pleased that when she watched the film, she seemed to really enjoy it. So that meant a lot to me.
You've worked with Joel Edgerton before on Midnight Special, but this is your first film with Ruth Negga. How did you end up casting those two in the lead roles? What did you feel made them, the right fit?
Well, when I write things, I write them for specific people. I wrote Mud for Matthew McConaughey. I wrote Midnight Special for Mike Shannon. When I wrote this script, I wrote it for Richard and Mildred Loving. That's who I was thinking about, because that's who I'd seen in all of this footage. So when I went out into the world looking for actors to play these real people, I needed to find people that looked like them and that could sound like them. And we actually had an audition for Mildred, and Ruth was the first person that showed up. And she just happened to be the best. She was incredible. She had been studying the same documentary I'd been studying. So she had this voice. She had Mildred's facial expressions, her kind of whole countenance already built into her performance. And I was floored by it. It wasn't until after the end of the audition that I realized she was Irish. At that point, though, it was too late. I'd already had her in my mind as Mildred. So Ruth really just, honestly, I say she fell in my lap. She was sought out by Francine Maisler, our casting director, who I've been working with since Mud, and who's really incredible. For Joel, obviously, Night Special together, and I saw him in that film. He plays a Texas State Trooper. I saw him take a voice example that we had and break it down very meticulously and apply it to all the lines in the script. And I was so impressed by that process that I knew if I gave him the archival footage of Richard Loving, that he could just nail it. And when you kind of close one eye and think of Joel with some male pattern baldness and, a mouth prosthetic for bad teeth, he kind of starts to look like Richard Loving. He's fair-haired. And I think if you look at the Grey Vallette photographs from Life magazine of the real couple, and you look at Joel and Ruth, I think you'll see why I made those decisions.
One of the hallmarks of this film creatively is its subtlety. And what struck me about that is that when a story has a quiet tone like this film does, and of course the Lovings also had that kind of quiet tone, it makes the small gestures and details and nuances really stand out. What kind of work went into making this story feel as lived in as possible in that way that really makes those details just such a rich part of it?
I mean, a lot of credit needs to go and does go to the actors. They're the ones that always get the credit, and deservedly so. It's very hard. It's easy to write on the page that they are a couple. It is hard to physically show that. The body language between those two is pretty remarkable, and I think really gets to the heart of the story. But then you have to look at the production design by Chad Keith, Aaron Bennick, our costume designer, Adam Stone, my cinematographer, Kenneth Walker, our hairstylist. These were all people that were doing the same thing that Ruth and Joel and I were doing, which is looking at this archival footage and just breaking it apart and studying every single detail, so that when I showed up on set, even though Aaron, our costume designer, hadn't really been talking to Chad, our production designer, necessarily, they'd all been referencing the same stuff. And when we put all those puzzle pieces together, it was fascinating. It was like you were looking at, the documentary, but lived out right in front of you. It's an experience I've never really had because I've never done a period piece before. But I think a lot of credit needs to be given to my crew and the people I worked with, because they did the research. They really, I couldn't walk onto set and tell you what was period correct or not. But these people, this team, they were exceptional at it.
The film is more about the lives of the Lovings themselves than about the courtroom battles involved in this case that would eventually make the Supreme Court. So it feels to me in many ways, and I think this is universally true in a way, that the real politics of this movie is empathy, which is that when you get to know who these people are and how they feel about their lives and about each other, it's kind of impossible to condemn this relationship as anything than just two people in a marriage who love each other. Do you think that a lot of social progress really just comes down to just the ability to empathize with what you're discussing, what you're talking about, what you're trying to decide on?
It's the perfect point. It's really the only point, which on the one hand makes this all seem overly simplistic, because it is a really simplistic idea. Just remember, these are people. We're talking about people. We aren't talking about issues. We aren't talking about religious beliefs or political stances. We're talking about people. It seems like such a simplistic idea, but it is the thing that for some reason we constantly have to be reminded of. And that's what Richard and Mildred are reminding us of. I think there's a sincerity in their relationship that is undeniable. And yeah, what you really want is maybe someone walking into the movie theater with their wife that they're fine with interracial marriage, but they have a problem with gay marriage for whatever reason. But maybe when they walk out of the theater, they say, I don't know, what's so bad about it? You know, there was nothing wrong with these two people. That maybe, I don't know, maybe people just open their minds up a little bit to the idea that these are just human beings trying to get by and live together. That's really, I think that's what Richard and Mildred are telling us, and with their story, and that's what I think we're trying to do with the film.
In many ways, especially at this point in American politics, it feels like that sense of empathy is in crucially short supply. What do you hope, or how do you hope, if at all, this film will kind of inform where we have gotten to as a society, which has kind of become very fragmented and polarized?
Well, one, it can show us what's possible with our citizenry. Richard and Mildred were not politicians or activists, really, even certainly not consciously so, or seeking that type of limelight. They were two people that simply loved one another, but that was enough. Through their existence, through them being themselves and being committed to one another, they changed things. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember right now, how much power we have as citizens, how much power we have as individuals. As long as we are staying true to something in ourselves, that is a hopeful place to be. And no matter who's president or what's going on, I think the power truly lies in the people. And Richard and Mildred remind us. Richard and Mildred remind us of that.
Your films up to this point have all seemed pretty different from each other, at least on the surface. Thriller like Take Shelter, sci-fi like Midnight Special, and now of course this docudrama about this real life story, Loving. Is there a common thread that unites your films in terms of what inspires you to tell these stories, or do you just kind of go where your inspiration leads you?
There's a common thread, and it's how they all relate to me emotionally, how I feel about them. And that's a lot easier to speak about with my first 4 films because they're all created from me. But even Loving, there's always one scene in all my films that is kind of the emotional pressure point of what I'm trying to do and say. I feel it in Loving, and I felt it in all those others. And all I'm trying to do as a storyteller, through the form of filmmaking, is emotionally connect with the audience. For me to feel something that is very palpable, whether it is the potential death of my son, or having my heart broken for the first time, or the anxiety of the world unraveling, I try and feel something that's very palpable, and I try and put it in the script, try and put it in the production, in the film, so that when an audience watches it, they get some semblance of that palpable feeling that I had. And that's communication. That means you're really having a dialogue with the audience. And that's that can be a powerful thing. I don't think all movies are important. In fact, I'm sure I've made some that aren't. But they have potential to affect people emotionally, and that engenders empathy, as you mentioned, and it actually furthers a conversation.
Now, one of the common threads, at least in terms of casting in your films, has been, of course, Michael Shannon, and he has a role in Loving as well. What has that working relationship been like between the two of you that keeps bringing you guys back together?
It's evolved because we've really become true friends. You know, I consider Mike Shannon one of my closer friends. He's actually more like a family member. He's kind of like an older brother. And he's also one of my most important creative collaborators. You cannot overestimate the importance that he's had on me as a director and me as a storyteller, and the way the films feel. Even the ones that he has small roles in, he's affected those. So, you know, I just consider him kind of my partner in all this. And I've been really lucky to have someone as intelligent as he is, helping me figure this stuff out. You know, because I learn something on every film, and a lot of times it's taught to me by Mike.
Well, I want to congratulate you again on this film, and on hopefully your continued success of this film going forward as more and more people see it.
I hope so too. It's an important story. We need to know about Richard and Mildred. So thanks for saying it. Thanks for talking.